All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dive deep into a secret 28-point peace plan that popped up in late 2025. This was a deal that promised to finally end the war in Ukraine, but in doing so, it almost blew the Western alliance to pieces.
So let's start with this quote. It just perfectly captures the shockwave this proposal sent through the world's capitals. For the officials in Kiev, you have to understand this wasn't just another diplomatic cable. This was, a full-blown existential crisis. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk you through the whole story, the anatomy of this secret deal. We'll look at the desperate situation on the battlefield that even made it possible, the absolutely shocking details that were hammered out behind closed doors, and the global firestorm that erupted right after. Okay, so first up, to really get this plan, you have to get the context. What was happening at the time? Well, by late 2025, the war in Ukraine had just become this brutal, grinding stalemate.
Now, what's so wild is that the stalemate wasn't broken by some big military victory on the battlefield. Nope, it was a political earthquake happening all the way over in Washington. After years of just bloody back-and-forth fighting, a new U.S. administration came in and decided it wanted out of what it was calling an endless war.
And the big idea driving all of this was something called the pivot to Asia. Basically, the new administration believed the real long-term threat was China. And every dollar, every missile, every bit of attention spent on Ukraine was a resource they couldn't point at the Indo-Pacific. It was as simple as that. So this new urgency, it led to something pretty radical. One of the most unconventional diplomatic moves we've seen in a long time. To get a deal done and get it done fast, the White House completely bypassed its own State Department. They set up this secret back channel.
And get this, the whole deal was basically hammered out by just two guys. On one side, Steve Witkoff, a real estate developer, no diplomatic experience whatsoever. On the other, Kirill Dmitriev, a key insider for Putin. They met in private, no professional diplomats in the room, and what they came up with, well, it read more like a business deal than a peace treaty.
All this back-channel stuff led to this incredibly dramatic summit in Alaska. I mean, the location alone was just dripping with Cold War symbolism. And it was the first time Vladimir Putin had been on U.S. soil in a decade. This was a huge deal.
And you gotta understand, this was not a friendly chat between equals. As the two leaders met, the U.S. Air Force flew its most advanced stealth aircraft right over their heads at low altitude. The message couldn't have been clearer. This was strength diplomacy, a raw show of power meant to set the tone for everything that followed. So what did these secret talks actually produce? A 28-point document that just landed like an absolute bombshell. Let's break down the 4 key pillars that really shook the world.
Okay, pillar number 1, territory. And this was just stunning. The plan didn't just ask Ukraine to accept the battle lines as they were. No, it demanded Kyiv give up all of Donbas, including places their soldiers were still fighting and dying for at that very moment.
Then there was the military piece. The plan demanded this huge forced demobilization. Ukraine's military, which had swelled to over 800,000 people to fight the invasion, would be capped at just 600,000. It was basically forcing them to disarm right in front of their attacker.
And then there was this. For a lot of people, this was the most shocking part, a full public amnesty. This little clause would grant total legal immunity to everyone for everything they did during the war. It was basically a get-out-of-jail-free card for any and all potential war crimes investigations.
And last but not least, the money. The plan said, hey, let's use $100 billion of frozen Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine. Sounds good, right? Well, there was a catch. The United States would take a 50% cut of any profits made from those funds. Peace was literally becoming a for-profit business venture.
So, as you can imagine, when the details of this 28-point plan finally got out, the world went nuts. The reaction was fast, it was furious, and it split allies right down the middle.
For President Zelensky in Kiev, this was a complete nightmare. He had an impossible choice: accept this humiliating deal or risk losing his most powerful ally completely. What he did was pretty brilliant, actually. He thanked the U.S. publicly to keep things smooth, but behind the scenes, he was frantically calling European leaders to try and kill the deal.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, a totally different reaction. Vladimir Putin basically said, yep, this looks great. He called it the basis for a final peace, which was a huge signal that the deal gave everything he really wanted.
But over in Europe, oh man, the feeling was just pure betrayal. Analysts were calling it an abomination, arguing that the US was throwing European security under the bus and basically telling aggressors that, yeah, crime pays, a terrifying precedent for them.
So you've got this massive European backlash, you've got Ukraine pushing back, it all created this huge diplomatic firestorm. And with the US setting a hard deadline of Thanksgiving for an answer, it became this frantic race against the clock to build a whole new deal from the wreckage of the first one.
And you can see the fight right here in this table. The European counterproposal pushed back hard on every single toxic point. They wanted higher troop limits for Ukraine. They said no way to recognizing seized land, and, this was huge, they demanded that the amnesty for war crimes be completely deleted from the document. And you know what? In these emergency talks in Geneva, the pressure actually worked. The US and Ukrainian delegations got together and started stripping out the worst parts of the original plan, the real poison pills. What came out of it was a new, shorter 19-point framework. But don't think for a second it was a done deal. Not even close. After the political agreement in Geneva, they had these secret military talks in Abu Dhabi to sort out the nitty-gritty details. And while the Americans were feeling optimistic, Russia started making noises, signaling they were not happy with the changes.
And that's pretty much where things are left hanging. The fate of this entire war is now balanced on a knife's edge. It all comes down to this fragile 19-point plan, a very reluctant Russia, and one last high-stakes trip for President Zelensky to Washington to try and lock this thing down.
So, after all that, we're left with this huge lingering question, right? Is a deal like this, one born from pure exhaustion and cold-hearted geopolitics, is it really a lasting peace? Or is it just a pause, a temporary truce that just sets the stage for the next, maybe even bloodier fight?